Kia ora. I'm Rachel Taulelei, Chair of the APEC Business Advisory Council. To reshape our future, we must change how we operate in the present. Sustainability and climate change are important conversations and topics that I'm personally passionate about. The pandemic highlighted the interconnectedness between social, environmental and economic challenges and has made many rethink their priorities. Renowned environmentalist Dr David Suzuki will share his perspective on environmental activism and observations of the natural world and explain why transformational change is not only an incremental change, but a required change to tackle the environmental crisis. Dr David Suzuki is a holder of more than 30 honorary degrees from universities around the world. His numerous awards include Companion to the Order of Canada, UNESCO's Kalinga Prize for Science, Inamori Ethics Prize, the United Nations Environment Programme Medal, and more. In 1990, he co-founded the David Suzuki Foundation to collaborate with Canadians from all walks of life on environmental conservation through science-based research, education, and policy. Dr Suzuki will encourage leaders from across the APEC region to think about how we can shape our future by changing what we do in the present and living in balance with the life support systems of the planet. Please welcome Dr David Suzuki.
I'm speaking to you from the traditional unceded territory of the Coast Salish people in British Columbia, Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish, who cared for these lands and waters for thousands of years, a true example of sustainability. Thank you, Rachel, for the warm and introduction, and for the privilege and opportunity of sharing a few ideas with you all as the end of the COVID pandemic continues to elude us. We cannot be distracted any longer from the far greater threat of climate change and biodiversity loss. We are all one species, Homo sapiens, so we share the same basic structure of our neurons, sense organs, and brain structure, yet we perceive the world through filters of gender, ethnicity, culture, religion, socioeconomic status, and personal experience that shape our values and the way we look at each other and the environment around us. And those values and perceptions determine our priorities and behavior. What I'm going to say may surprise you, perhaps even upset you, but I beg you to listen with an open mind, suspend economic or political priorities which might limit your response. You see, I'm a biologist, and I see our current problems through the lenses of evolution. Every culture has its origin story that explains how we got here and why we are here, and today, science provides origin stories that go back beyond human memory. Using DNA, the genetic material, scientists have traced the movement of people across the planet, and all trails lead back to Africa 150,000 years ago. That was our birthplace. The purpose for all life is survival of the species, leaving a next generation, and our survival depended on an immense brain that endowed us with curiosity, observational skills, creativity, and a massive memory. The human brain created technology, spears, digging tools, rope, needles, stone axes. We learn from experience and pass those lessons on from generation to generation. So social and cultural evolution was far faster than biological evolution. The result is enormous cultural diversity among people all around the world, even though biologically we are all one species. And our brain invented a concept called the future that we could affect by what we do in the present. At first, it was simple. You're walking along a path, it branches, and we remember on the right, we ran into a saber-toothed tiger. But when we went left, there were edible plants. So let's go left. Foresight was the ability to deliberately choose to avoid danger and exploit opportunity. And it was a powerful strategy that helped us get us to survive till now. Today, Planning for the future underlies everything we do, from our personal lives to corporate and government priorities and decisions. And now scientists with supercomputers tell us what lies ahead. But we are turning our backs on them. Think of anti-vaxxers and governments and corporations that ignore or deny the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Yet our very success as a species is to look ahead, recognize dangers and opportunities, and deliberately choose a path to avoid danger. Scientists have known about greenhouse gases since 1824. And when Svante Arrhenius won a Nobel Prize in 1903, he spoke of global warming by humans. By the 1960s, scientists were convinced that burning fossil fuels was warming the planet. I did my first program on global warming for The Nature of Things in 1989. And then I interviewed over 140 scientists for a 5-part radio series titled It's a Matter of Survival that showed nature was being destroyed at a terrifying rate. So in 1990, my wife and I started the David Suzuki Foundation to use the best scientific information to find the underlying root causes of our destructiveness so we can find genuine solutions. In 1992, more than half of all Nobel Prize winners signed World Scientists' Warning to Humanity. Some of what it says was, I quote, "Human beings in the natural world are on a collision course. If not checked, many of our current practices put at serious risk the future we wish for human society, and may so alter the living world that it will be unable to sustain life in the manner that we know. No more than one or a few decades remain before the chance to avert the threats we now confront will be lost." End of quote. 25 years later, in 2017, more than 17,000 scientists signed a second warning, indicating the problems warned of in 1992 are still here and far worse. In 2019, millions of young people around the world, inspired by Greta Thunberg, marched to demand a future. Then Australia and the west coast of North America erupted in the flame. 2020 was supposed to be the turnaround year for climate, but instead the world locked down in response to COVID-19. Scientific reports have long warned that we are degrading air, water, soil, and biodiversity, the factors that keep us alive and healthy, and now we've run out of time. As the UN head says, we are at a code red planetary emergency. The planet is not in trouble, we are. The way we responded to World War II, the space war after Sputnik, the COVID pandemic, shows what can be done in a real emergency. Suddenly, money is not an issue. Government can crank out tens of billions of dollars, and all the parties can work together for the common goal of victory. And that's how we have to respond to climate change and biodiversity loss. As we emerge from this pandemic and confront a climate and biodiversity emergency, incremental change like carbon taxes and carbon offsets are no longer adequate. The IMF reported global subsidies of coal, oil, and gas totaled $5.9 trillion in 2020. That's $11 million per minute. Subsidizing with the public's taxes the most profitable sector in society to produce the fuels that are causing climate change. We need societal transformation. Immediately halt all subsidies to the fossil fuel industry and construction of new infrastructure. leave most of our known reserves in the ground, and hope that climate chaos that is already beginning will not make the planet unlivable for human beings. We are inventive, but we don't know enough to anticipate the negative effects of all we do. And we must avoid desperate measures such as geoengineering that will only generate new problems. The massive fires, floods, hurricanes, drought, and climate refugees just hint at what is coming. We cannot manage climate change, but we can stop adding emissions that make it worse while protecting and restoring nature that is our best carbon remover. The crises of climate change and biodiversity loss are just symptoms of an underlying root cause of our destructiveness, which is the way we see ourselves on this planet. For 95% of our existence, we were hunter-gatherers who followed plants and animals on their migrations through the seasons, dependent on nature for everything. About 50,000 years after we evolved on the African grasslands, we began to move into new territory where we were an invasive species. We didn't know how things worked in these new lands, but we were smart. And even with simple tools, we were a deadly predator. So we had to learn to live in balance in new surroundings through the observations, mistakes, successes, and failures. This was priceless knowledge to live sustainably, and that is a basis of indigenous cultures around the world. We have always known we are one small strand in a complex web of relationships with all other species of plants and animals, with the air, water, soil, and the sunlight. Other species of animals and plants are not resources or opportunity. They are our kin, related to us through a shared evolutionary history, and who, in acts of generosity, allow us to take them. In a web where everything is connected, anything we do has repercussions and therefore responsibilities. This is an ecocentric perspective that demands reciprocity. We celebrate and thank nature for what we receive, and we acknowledge responsibility to act properly so she can continue to be abundant and generous. 10,000 years ago, that's the last 5% of our existence, agriculture changed the course of human history and led to modern civilization. Religions guide our behavior and relationships with each other and seem to suggest we are special. We're different from the rest of life on earth. By the Renaissance, Francis Bacon proclaimed, "Scientia potestas est." Knowledge is power. And scientia, knowledge or science, meant progress. The Industrial Revolution, beginning 200 to 300 years ago, seemed to show that our intelligence enables us to escape the constraints of nature. We created telescopes and microscopes, machines to work tirelessly around the clock, move immense weights, or drill through Earth's crust. Planes fly faster than the speed of sound. We can destroy entire ecosystems, dive the deepest oceans, even escape gravity and explore other planets. The only limit seems to be our imagination. There are millions of other species on Earth, but we think we are the most important. We're at the center of everything, and we can take over most of the planet, leaving a tiny amount, 10, 12% for all the rest of nature? This is an anthropocentric way of seeing the world, and that is how the systems to guide and constrain us, the legal, economic, and political, are constructed. Laws define property and human rights, but where in our legal system is the right of a bird to live as it evolved to, a forest to exist as a community of organisms, or a river to flow as it has for millennia? Rivers in New Zealand, Ecuador, and Canada have recently been granted personhood status. But who the hell are we in the first place to confer rights on everything else? And what about the legal borders we draw around countries and provinces and property? Nature doesn't care because air, water, animals, plants pay no attention to human boundaries, yet that's how we try to manage them through our laws and borders. Our economic systems are based on the philosophy of cancer, endless growth, which is impossible in a finite world. And most scientists I speak to agree, the global economy is already far too big. But economic growth has become the measure of progress. So we never ask the important questions. What is an economy for? Are there no limits? How much is enough? Are we happier with all this stuff? Should any human being be allowed to be a billionaire? And because the economy is built on human creativity and human productivity, when we destroy a forest, flood a valley, or burn down an ecosystem, the loss of nature is just an externality, the price of doing business. Recently, UK economist Partha Dasgupta released The Economics of Biodiversity, a study showing that the economy is inevitably ecologically destructive because it pays no attention to all of the things nature does to keep the planet habitable for animals like us, like the removal of carbon from the air and return of oxygen by plants, creation of soil, filtration of water, pollination of flowering plants, capture of energy from the sun, and so on. We must put the eco back into economics because our actions are leaving enormous ecological deficits that will be paid by future generations who will have to live with a profoundly degraded planet. It's suicidal when our lives and well-being are made possible by nature while the economy itself is built on raw materials, energy, and waste disposal provided by nature. And we are told that democracy is the best political system because government policy and action are dictated by the voting of all citizens. But those most affected by what governments do or do not do are children, future generations. And for that matter, trees, fish, birds, oceans, the atmosphere, they don't vote. So they are not on the political agenda. The Minister of Fisheries and Oceans' highest priority can't be fish and the oceans. They don't vote. And it's the same for the ministers of environment, forestry, even climate change. We boast of being intelligent, but we are still animals. If we don't have air for 3 minutes, we die. If we breathe polluted air, it makes us sick. Yet we use air as a garbage can for our toxic wastes and chemicals, and it's the same with the way we treat water, with the very food we eat and soil, which are essential for our health and survival. Our legal, economic, and political systems assume that we are in charge, but we don't know enough to control and manage nature. The only thing we can try to manage is ourselves. And we can modify the systems we create to fit the needs of nature. The great opportunity today is that there are still people who live through ecocentric values, who fight for their territory, which is everything to them, because they have an overwhelming sense of responsibility to protect and care for the land. Of course, I am speaking of Indigenous people all over the world, the only people with a track record of living sustainably in place for thousands of years. No corporation or government can make that claim for even a decade. What Indigenous people offer is the perceptual filters that guide and shape our relationship with nature. We settlers have to relearn Indigenous values to shape and guide our policies, strategies, and actions, because clearly the colonial paradigm does not work. The principles of UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and in Canada, the recommendations of the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, provide a path to social justice, but just as important, to guide all of us to find a better way of living on this planet. We cannot go back to the way things were before the COVID lockdown. This is an emergency. Thank you.
Wow. Dr. David Suzuki, introduced by Rachel Taulelei. Go the Hurricanes. Wow.
Speaking of hurricanes.
That was profound. It was enthralling. It was resonant for so many reasons, particularly as Indigenous people of Aotearoa New Zealand, as Māori, and obviously the reinforcement of those kind of values, the reinforcement of Indigenous values, people who have lived, as Dr. David Suzuki has said, for thousands of years on the land in a sustainable way, the only people who have lived for 1,000 years in a sustainable way. Wow, what a presentation.
He is a phenomenal thought leader, and as you mentioned earlier, off camera, of course, an overachiever, 30+ honorary awards, and you can understand.
I'll accept everything he says. Because
absolutely. A few gems from Dr. David Suzuki there for me. One, we must put the eco back into economy. Also, to suspend to business leaders and to the leaders out there, suspend economic responsibilities and put eco, the economy, not the economy, but the ecology, back as the core focus of any business decisions going forward.
That's right. And the oft-quoted phrase, I think attributed to Sir Francis Bacon, that was mentioned by Dr. David Suzuki, knowledge is power, scientia potentia est. Again, wow, just an amazing presentation. There will be more on that, and obviously talking about that in this session. So very much looking forward to our other speakers in this session as well.
Absolutely. As Dr. David Suzuki mentioned and has already outlined, this session is focused on the sustainability imperative, including sustainable growth, climate change, and food. We'll be discussing the opportunities to address climate change and to foster green, resilient and inclusive growth as the APEC region focuses on COVID-19 recovery efforts, as well as the areas the region should be thinking about and working together on to tackle the environmental crisis and to live more harmoniously with Mother Nature. Coming
up soon, we will hear from our panel with a discussion on a sustainable future. Now, this will be moderated by Amy Gunia, a reporter at Time based in Hong Kong. But just before that, giving us a short address on this topic, it is my privilege and pleasure to introduce Michelle Bachelet, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. Please welcome Michelle.
It is my great pleasure to join this APEC 2021 CEO Summit. I thank the Government of New Zealand, the Maori people as the traditional owners of the land, and all the participants for the opportunity to address you today on one of the major imperatives of our world, sustainability. You as business leaders have a crucial role to play. These are times of emergency. After 18 months, we are still struggling with a global pandemic that has exposed and exacerbated inequalities, discrimination, and numerous human rights gaps. In addition, the triple planetary crisis of climate change, pollution, and biodiversity loss created by human action and inaction is directly and severely threatening human rights, the future of our economies, and our very survival. Those who have least contributed to the climate crisis are often the most affected, including millions of people across the Pacific region. And as in the case of COVID-19, the greatest impacts are felt by the most vulnerable and marginalized people and groups. This includes indigenous peoples, the ancestral guardians of the land that are now also facing the consequences of humanity's unsustainable consumption and production at the global level. No doubt, we're living in times of emergency, but we're also witnessing a global rise of consciousness. Across the world, people are already taking to the streets and using strategic litigation to demand climate justice. And I can tell you these movements will only grow. A tangible result of this mobilization is the growing recognition of the inherent links between human rights and the environment. Nowhere is this more visible than in last month's historical resolution, in which for the first time the Human Rights Council recognized that a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is a human right. Another example are the climate laws recently introduced in Fiji, New Zealand, and the Republic of Korea. I call on all APEC members to develop ambitious national determined contributions and introduce their own national legislation to enable stronger climate action. Adaptation and mitigation measures must be centered in human rights, ensuring meaningful inclusion and participation of all stakeholders. The private sector has a central role. To avert future climate harms and ensure climate justice, business enterprises must be part of the solution. I will tell you why. Much of the CO emissions causing climate change come from business-driven economic activity. To respect human rights, businesses can and should support initiatives to prevent, mitigate, and adapt to climate change, including through innovation. This year, we celebrate the 10th anniversary of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which reflect existing global consensus on the distinct but interrelated human rights responsibilities of governments and businesses. Under the Guiding Principles, businesses must respect human rights, including the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. For meaningful climate action to take place, the private sector, including financing corporations, needs to put in place human rights due diligence mechanisms. These are meant to ensure that people's rights are not negatively impacted, to limit negative environmental and climate change impacts, and contribute positively to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. My office is ready to support countries in the development of their own national action plans. In the Pacific, we have been organizing discussions, trainings, and capacity-building workshops on the UN Guiding Principles for the last 3 months. I encourage you all to participate in the upcoming Second Business and Human Rights Pacific Regional Forum, which will take place later this month. The Guiding Principles also reminds us that states have a duty to protect human rights against the negative impact of business activities. As a former head of state, I know that if companies are to respect human rights, governments must ensure that the correct institutional and economic incentives are in place and provide necessary guidance. In that regard, I welcome New Zealand's recent adoption of a law requiring financial firms to report and act on climate-related risk. Dear colleagues, recovering better from COVID-19 is our duty. We need to increase investment in social protection and universal health coverage. We need a new social contract and an economic model that puts human rights and human beings at the center of economic policy, accelerating our path towards realizing the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Recovering better is also an opportunity to address the climate crisis by building new systems that are cleaner, fairer, and more resilient. As governments and businesses adopt measures to revive their activities, economies, and societies, they have a shared responsibility to protect human rights, address inequalities, and make a transformational shift to a more just and green human rights-based economy. And we need to act now. And we need your full support and leadership. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the introduction and welcome, everyone. I'm Amy Gunya. I'm a reporter for Time. We have 3 great panelists here today to talk about sustainability. Let's start with Rachel Taulelei, who's based in New Zealand. She founded the sustainable seafood company Yellow Brick Road served as the CEO of the Maori-owned food and beverage company Kono. She co-founded the business design and brand strategy firm OHO, and she's the chair of the APEC Business Advisory Council. Rachel, welcome. Why is sustainability important for food security?
Well, kia ora, Amy. Great to see you there in Chicago. Look, sustainable food system is a win-win, I'd say, for both food security and the environment. And there's a lot of contributions you could make to that statement, but fundamentally, for me, you know, it's arguable that the trade distorting subsidies that we see in and around the region are implicated in increased pollution, overuse of water resources, and biodiversity loss. And the incentives that incentivize overproduction go hand in hand with a heavy environmental footprint. So the subsidies themselves undermine local production and really impede local communities and leave them with sort of an unpredictable food supply oftentimes. So a sustainable approach means that the system that we can have works in greater harmony with the planet and with people and leaves fewer people going hungry. So, you know, that's one element. That's the trade distorting subsidies, which are about having a sustainable food system. Then there's the climate. You know, we in the primary industry or the food production industry are really set upon often by environmental events, whether it's floods or droughts or you know, pandemics. And we need the system to work in a seamless fashion around the region. We need food to go where the need is the greatest. That provides food security for people around the region. And in order for that to happen, it has to happen in a you know, a digitally enhanced, safe, seamless way so that food security is top of the agenda for those who need it most.
Great. Now I'd like to introduce Hak-Yoon Min, or Jo Min, who's the Executive Vice President and the Head of Corporate Social Responsibility of CJ Cheiljedong in South Korea. Jo, your company manufactures a range of products, including food, bio, and animal feed. What's your company doing to make food more sustainable?
The food industry actually touches a very wide range of industry, from agriculture, fishery, all the way to even the restaurant and even service industry. Our product touches everywhere from agriculture side to the consumption. So our slogan, ESG slogan, is a nature to nature. And our philosophy in every step of business cycle, from eco-friendly ingredients and then all eco-friendly packaging, and find a more efficient way to recycle water waste materials, and then how to actually conserve the water better in our production process. So I think these days, we are really focusing on technology. There are many things to bring the more sustainable food cycle in. We can actually achieve many things with technologies, such as there's a renewable energy in the manufacturing cycle, and in the plastics, like a reduction of plastics, as well as we are actually developing biodegradable plastics using our fermentation technology. And with the also raw material side, there is a development of a vegan substitute meat, alternative eggs. All these things are happening to make the world more sustainable as a food company.
Great. Let's move to Julia Torreblanca. She's the Vice President for Corporate Affairs at Minera Cerro Verde and a member of the APEC Business Advisory Council for Peru. Julia, how can mining companies ensure that communities benefit from mining, especially the poorest and most marginalized people?
Actually, companies can do so by trying to plan their activities in connection with the needs of the communities in their surroundings, assuring transparent dialogue with all the leaders of the community, all the stakeholders, and assuring that the objectives of the company can meet also the needs of the community. For example, in APEC, we have observed so many good examples of companies committed with human development and taking initiatives that goes from creating health and education infrastructure to promoting women's empowerment. At Freeport, the company Cerro Verde belongs to, we seek to give back to the communities where we operate and create positive, long-lasting relationships through social programs and partnerships, as well as reinvesting in our operations for the long term. In Cerro Verde, We promote development of initiatives aligned to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and we try to focus our programs in health, education, women, and sanitation. For instance, knowing that Arequipa, the city where Cerro Verde operates, is a city located in a desert and needed of water, is generally scarce, we have developed what we call the virtuous circle of water. This project started back in the years 2000 in order to promote development of the company, of Cerro Verde. We needed water to develop our concentrator, and the farmers and also the community needed water. So we started this circle of water by building dams in the highlands that collect more water for the full community. Also, we agreed with the stakeholders related to water and water authorities that there was the need to have a potable water plant for all the people that were arriving to the community and didn't have water or had to collect water by buckets or get it by a water truck. So we built and financed a potable water plant that today serves 350,000 people, in addition to the connections that take that water to the north and east cone of the city of Arequipa, that is the second largest city of Peru. And we finished the virtual circle of water by building a wastewater treatment plant that today treats 95% of the domestic sewage of Arequipa, while in the past, 95% of the sewage was going to the river without any treatment and ended up in our stomachs, carrots, and strawberries that we had on our tables. So that's what responsible mining does, trying to meet and achieve common goals by dialogue, transparency, and making sure that all the stakeholders are involved and included in decision taking.
Great. My next question is for all of the panelists. So as APEC economies focus on recovering from COVID-19, how can they ensure that the recovery is both green and inclusive? Rachel, perhaps we can start with you.
Sure. Well look, Amy, inclusion has been one of the central themes of the APEC conversation this year, and we have spent a really serious amount of time, I would say, to having discussions around the inclusion of MSMEs, around women, and around Indigenous peoples. And it's fair to say that those are the three people who have been most adversely affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. So one in particular that stood out for me is in and around the Indigenous economies, and you will have probably heard New Zealand speak about this through the duration of the CEO Summit and certainly through the year of APEC hosting. And that's because we are deeply committed to inclusion. We're deeply committed to, you've been speaking of marginalised communities. This is where you might find Indigenous conversations throughout the region. And we have 270 million Indigenous peoples who largely haven't been in this conversation. And so part of what we have tried to do this year, and one of the keys to economic recovery of the region, we believe, is to bring these conversations to the table and have a very purposeful and meaningful conversations about how we can support them. One of the ways that we've done that this year within APEC was with Indigenous business leaders dialogues, both in APEC and APEC. We have created a statement of intent, or a statement of principles of importance that has been annexed to the report. And that covers really ideas of, according priority to developing Indigenous economic inclusion, of stimulating and incentivising business growth for our Indigenous peoples, of identifying and genuinely addressing the infrastructure needs of rural and remote, in particular, Indigenous communities. And the last point is one that really interests me, is in and around the collection of data as it pertains to our Indigenous peoples and economies, and in that, turning our mind to the issues of data sovereignty. So all of the issues around climate change and digital enablement and economic integration, whilst they apply to our economies generally, they also apply to what we would call sort of small but mighty parts of all of our 21 economies through the APEC region. And in order to get back to being that dynamic, prosperous region that we are, there's a real opportunity for us all to turn our minds to how we bring in the most underrepresented, the most marginalised communities, because they have an enormous amount to offer us as a people.
Great. Julia, what do you think? How can we ensure that the recovery is green and inclusive?
First of all, I do believe that we have responsibility to work all together, and both the public and the private sector in order to achieve this. And I think that the way to achieve it is, as Rachel mentioned, working not only with women, but indigenous communities in one hand, but also making sure that everybody has access to education, have the tools in order to be able to connect with the rest of the world. And we have seen during this period of time that no one planned and no one wished, how virtuality has become an essential part of economy. So we need to focus on those communities that need to be connected with the rest of the world in order to assure their prosperity as well, focusing on people and not only human rights, but access to education, as I mentioned before, opportunities to work and training. We have a program like Dream Builder that Freeport has a sponsor and Thunderbird prepare for us, that is available for everybody. It's a way to understand and to learn about business capacities that can help MSMEs and another kind of business to improve not only the way that they work, but also the profits they receive in the world. So this is something that different business can offer. And we can also work together with our authorities, making sure that the money that is available and the budgets they have are properly spent in the correct fields.
Great. Joe, what do you think?
The company, CJ Cherijadang, started in 1953, so it's 68 years old. We started as a sugar manufacturer, and then now we expanded into there is more than 10,000 products that we are producing, all food items and the biofermentation items. But we recently only went global with the brand Bibigo. And with that, we realized that in 68 years, just last week, we redefined our goals or the growth areas. And one of them is sustainability. So those are 4 pillars were culture, platform, wellness, and sustainability. There, what we really focus on is that we can really achieve this alone. So we are working more closely, communicating with the consumers, and then many of our consumers are actually the women, young people. And also, we also have to put together brain with our business partners, the developing new materials so all our packaging, there are enormous amount of packaging around the food items, and there used to be many restrictions because it has to be transported safely. There's a food safety issue with the packaging. We're actually coming up with a more different newer technology items that it has to be biodegradable. And I think our fermentation technology is helping on that side. And we are willing to work with all our partners, not only in Korea, but globally. So I think, like all this ESG concept, and then particularly, and then also SDG concepts, the last one, the participation or cooperation becomes more and more important. These issues are too big for one company or even one country to deal. And we're willing to work with many different partners. And then actually in New Zealand, there is a team of team of scientists who's actually working on how to reduce the methane from the animal gas. So, we're actually working with that team so that we can, how do we actually improve the animal feed so that it eventually reduce the methane. So I guess my conclusion is that it's something that we have to do it as a collective impact. We're willing to do that. And then there are many things to be shared with each other.
You mentioned sustainable packaging. I just want to focus on food for a minute. So probably a question for Rachel and Joe. Are consumers looking for more sustainable food? And I guess what factors are most important to consumers now when they are making food choices?
Can I go? The food safety. So I think, the neighborhood food or more seasonal food, those things are very important because if you actually get the more naturally grown food, then that definitely reduce the, the energy to go into those things. So the consumers actually realize that that's even healthier. So obviously their focus will be health of their own body, but I think the health in whole ecosystem. So, like along the way, like how what I eat is being produced. And then the packaging had to be, I think the focus, it's only very recently the consumers actually pay on the packaging on the environmental side. Before it was like my own safety or design or, like taste. But I hopefully eventually people are being quickly educated in that sense that they are willing to compromise a little better for the whole environmental sustainability.
Rachel, is there anything to add?
Yeah, there is a little. I mean, I think that consumers today are fundamentally different to the consumers that we were 18 months ago or 2 years ago. So those of us who, may have shopped on the odd occasion online, we're now there in droves. And I think so our shopping habits have changed, and equally the things that we prioritise or value have changed as well. So in my experience of being a food producer and a food exporter and having engaged with a number of markets over the years, I think fundamentally our consumers want to make the choices that meet their needs, that reward them for their needs at the moment, but equally they don't want to make a decision now that has an adverse effect on anyone else in the world or on anyone else in the country of origin of the product that they're purchasing. And so if you can satisfy those needs, if you can satisfy the knowledge that they're making a decision that's not going to be affecting a rainforest or a community or a labour force in an adverse way, then that's certainly a step in the direction of your product over other. The trick is how you convey that to them, because it's a very busy market. There's a lot of messages that people try to convey in that space, and I think it's lucky in a way that New Zealand does have a great amount of social license world round. It's just how we might capitalise that as we go forward. But good relationships with your suppliers, food safety, but ultimately, are you being what we would call in New Zealand as a food producer, are you being a good ancestor? Because that's part of what we think about when we produce food products. Are you making those right decisions in its production?
Great. I want to aim my next question at Julia. How can companies ensure that ESG factors trickle down all the way through an organization, say all the way from the board of directors down to people who are working on a mining site?
Yeah, obviously it's not easy when you have a corporation as large as Freeport, for example, but governance and oversight of sustainability starts at Freeport's board of directors and cascades down through our leadership team to each of our sites. How this is done? Assuring that all of us have the same principles, policies, making sure that everybody understands that ESG is a priority not only for the board, but for every worker and employee, assuring an open communication and a direct line also between the representatives of ESG that each site has. For example, I'm involved in ESG at Cerro Verde, and I have direct line to Richard Ackerson, Kathleen Quirk, and the people who are the decision makers at the end of the day also. So this is very important to assure there is communication, to assure that the same policies, and also that everybody is committed in order to comply not only with good social policy and environmental management and governance at all levels, but all levels, including tailings, including water management, but that every worker understands these needs and priorities in order for everybody to have the successful results that we are seeking for. We promote a culture that people needs to speak up, okay, and also to take ownership of each of their acts. And in order to do so, all of our sites have the same policies as I mentioned, but also we comply with ICMM's principles, and as well as Copper Mark. More recently, we expect all our sites to be recognized by Copper Mark as responsible producers, and that certifies that our products go, since the moment they are planned to the moment that they are sold in the markets, comply with the best mining practices that the industry requires.
Great. That went quickly, but we are out of time. So thank you very much, Julia, Joe, and Rachel, for sharing your insights with us today. Back to the hosts.
Thank you very much, Amy, for facilitating that session for us. And what an interesting session it was. And also thank you to your panellists, of course, to Hee-kyung Jo Min from South Korea, Julia Torreblanca there from Peru, and of course Rachel Taulelei, who was there in Wellington. Of course, she was also the chair of APEC, the APEC Business Advisory Council. So great to have those perspectives in there. So much in that conversation, really. Again, I've said resonate before, but I think it is worth applying again here as well. Because, you know, we talked about inclusion previously, and again, Rachel touched on that in that discussion as well. But particularly with regard to food production there, she mentioned a couple of things. One, obviously, is that demand must, or the system needs to work to get food to where it is needed, to get food to where it is needed most across the APEC region. But the other point she talked about, and I might get you just to define this for our audience, Ordini, if that's okay, quote, are you being a good ancestor? So what does that mean, are you being a good ancestor? Because Rachel has mentioned this, and I think for Indigenous peoples, we kind of understand what that is, right? Okay. The value base of Indigenous peoples is fairly similar across the world. So what are those kind of values that are being talked about?
Well, I suppose the decisions that we make today have an impact on the future of tomorrow, and in order to gauge what sort of decision is best for our future, we have to look backwards. Koe te ahua o tāte Māori te tiro ki te ao. That's the Māori way of viewing the world. We make decisions today based on where we've come from and where we want to go to, and of course it's always about the people-centric. People are always, environment is always at the foot of every decision that we try to make.
Yeah, that's right. I think the other thing that was really interesting for me was, I mean, Joe talked about the fact that it's nature to nature, right? So that the whole process has to undertake that kind of approach. Use of technology across the whole food production cycle is sustainable. The ingredients, the way she used about the example where she was working in New Zealand with methane and also, you know, the food that was being fed to the animals in the first place, right? So that whole process across the whole production line is really important.
Decisions in production, in the production of food from start to end. I thought also Julia raised a good point about compliance. It doesn't just end at the production of the food from the growth to the shelf, but it's also about how do you actually market that and commercialise food, you know, to the general markets, to the open markets, and what are the compliance issues that businesses, whether they're MSMEs or SMEs, facing, you know, in order to provide locally and internationally.
There's a really good point that she also made, I think, on the back of that, which was to plan activities with the needs of the communities. And she talked about the disastrous impacts of work being done which weren't aligned with, or activities being planned that weren't aligned with and worked with the communities themselves, which was the sewerage that had been let out. And part of one community, 95%, I think, raw sewage out into one part of that community, which is really important. So it talks about the need to also, when we talk about inclusion, it's not just in terms of participation through employment, it's also about inclusion of communities as a part of that process as well, which I think is a point that other people have talked about here. And she also made the point, and this is fairly audacious actually, so I think it's a good point to be made, where Julia talked about, well, how do you apply ESG? And of course, Julia talked about the fact that they apply that right throughout the whole structure of a company, right? So it's not just a governance responsibility, it's not just a board of directors responsibility, is that they encourage, potentially even compel employees from all levels of an organisation to, as she says, to uphold and be responsible producers, and that every worker understands this and they are emboldened and indeed enabled to be able to undertake that process themselves. But the focus here was on social responsibility at all levels, and in particular also talking about policy prioritisation. I'll tell you what, the more I go through these days, the more I find out that I don't know much.
You and me both.
No, it's true.
I'm not happy. I'm like, yes, well.
There's a great artist in Māoridom we have here in New Zealand. His name was Prince Tui Teka. And as the name would suggest, he was an amazing artist, but he said he had a song called The More I Find Out, The Less I Know. It was a smash hit within Māoridom, not necessarily on the charts, but it's true. The more I find out as we go through these sessions, the less I know. So I really thank the panel for that discussion, and also to Amy Gunia, the Times reporter there based in Chicago, who facilitated that discussion with us.
Kia ora. To introduce our next APEC economy leader, His Excellency Mr. Arohamai Nguyen Xuan Phúc, President of Vietnam. It is my pleasure to introduce Mitchell Pham, Chair of the Digital Council for Aotearoa New Zealand and Honorary Advisor at the Asia New Zealand Foundation. Mitchell, kaya koe te wā.
Kia ora. I'm Mr. Pham, New Zealand Honorary Advisor at the Asia New Zealand Foundation, Chair of NZ Tech, FinTech NZ, and the Digital Council for Aotearoa New Zealand, and Director of CodeHQ, a technology business operating between New Zealand and Vietnam. One of the major themes for the APEC CEO Summit is sustainability and climate change. APEC economies need to collaborate on climate action, environmental governance, sustainable development, and low-carbon solutions. As a Kiwi who was born in Vietnam and made in New Zealand, a serial entrepreneur operating out of my 2 home bases in Auckland and Ho Chi Minh cities, an advisor to the New Zealand government on the future of our economy and society with digital technologies and our relationship with the Asia-Pacific region, and last but not least, a technology industry leader working to bring sustainability into tech, raising awareness of data and technology as a necessary enabler, and promoting innovation for sustainability. It is my absolute privilege and great pleasure to be introducing the President of Vietnam, Mr. Nguyễn Phúc, today. Climate change is undoubtedly a major collective threat to many countries and to our planet. Transitioning to a green net zero emission economy is an inevitable trend and imperative to limiting global warming. Like New Zealand, Vietnam is committed to playing an active part in facing this collective challenge and taking climate actions for sustainability. Please join me in welcoming the President of Vietnam, Mr. Nguyễn Phúc.
Thưa quý vị, tôi rất vui mừng cùng các nhà lãnh đạo APEC phát biểu tại Hội nghị Thượng đỉnh Doanh nghiệp APEC 2021 về chủ đề chiến lược phát triển bền vững và ứng phó với biến đổi khí hậu. Một chủ đề có ý nghĩa chiến lược không chỉ đối với các doanh nghiệp mà toàn bộ các quốc gia, các nền kinh tế APEC và toàn cầu. Điều này cũng tương đồng với trọng tâm thảo luận của Hội nghị Thượng đỉnh về khí hậu của Liên Hiệp Quốc tháng 4 năm 2021 và Hội nghị biến đổi khí hậu COP26 tháng 11 năm 2021. Thưa quý vị, hành tinh xanh đang rung chuyển bởi tác động cộng hưởng chưa từng có của biến đổi khí hậu, thiên tai khắc nghiệt, suy thoái môi trường, đại dịch Covid-19 với những hậu quả rất nặng nề, vượt xa tất cả các dự báo, tác động đến mọi quốc gia, nền kinh tế, buộc chúng ta phải thay đổi sản xuất, kinh doanh, xã hội, đời sống người dân bị đảo lộn. Thời gian không chờ đợi, bởi những thách thức đó mỗi ngày càng nghiêm trọng hơn, thúc giục chúng ta phải chung tay hành động. Trong hơn 3 thập kỷ qua, APEC không chỉ là động lực tăng trưởng toàn cầu, thúc đẩy thương mại, tạo thuận lợi cho đầu tư doanh nghiệp, mà còn tiên phong về quản lý, ứng phó thiên tai, phát triển năng lượng sạch, bảo tồn đa dạng sinh học, thương mại, hàng hóa, môi trường. Hướng tới tầm nhìn APEC 2040, các nhà lãnh đạo APEC đang đoàn kết vượt qua mọi khác biệt, đi đầu dẫn dắt các nỗ lực hợp tác nhanh hơn, mạnh mẽ hơn để vượt qua cao hơn, lên trước những tiếng chuông cảnh báo thách thức, rủi ro. Gìn giữ môi trường sống an nhiên, phát triển bền vững. Theo đó, là một nhà lãnh đạo trong cộng đồng APEC, tôi xin chia sẻ. Ứng phó biến đổi khí hậu là trách nhiệm chung của tất cả quốc gia, các nền kinh tế, đòi hỏi nỗ lực hợp tác quốc tế sáng tạo, hiệu quả, tăng cường hỗ trợ nguồn lực, công nghệ mới và nâng cao năng lực cho các nước đang phát triển. Trong các quyết sách, nhà nước phải vì ích lâu dài, tiếp cận toàn diện từ hạ tầng tài chính, thương mại đến bảo vệ môi trường và lao động xã hội. Trong vai trò dẫn dắt, nhà nước không làm thay các chủ thể trong xã hội mà khuyến khích tạo dựng thể chế, lợi ích phù hợp để huy động nguồn lực từ các doanh nghiệp, người dân, phát huy các dự án công tư cho tăng trưởng xanh. Thưa quý vị, doanh nghiệp là chủ thể của hoạt động sản xuất kinh doanh, lợi ích bền vững của doanh nghiệp gắn liền với sự ổn định, phát triển của cả cộng đồng xã hội. Trong đó, xu thế phát triển với phát thải carbon thấp, tăng trưởng xanh cũng là cơ hội để thay đổi, nâng cao sức cạnh tranh, phát triển bền vững của doanh nghiệp. Cùng với trách nhiệm dẫn dắt của nhà nước và tạo dựng môi trường kinh doanh thuận lợi, tôi có một số ý đối với các doanh nghiệp. Mỗi doanh nghiệp nên có kế hoạch và lộ trình cắt giảm khí thải, tuân thủ mục tiêu, các chỉ số quy định của quốc gia về kiểm soát mức phát thải khí nhà kính, tiêu hao năng lượng xanh hóa các ngành kinh tế, lối sống và tiêu dùng. Thứ hai, hãy đầu tư cho tương lai khi hướng vào các dự án năng lượng sạch, phát triển công nghệ mới với giá trị xanh ngày càng cao, xây dựng nền nông nghiệp xanh, thông minh, hình thành các chuỗi cung ứng xanh và khuyến khích thay đổi hành vi thân thiện với môi trường của người tiêu dùng. Cuối cùng, Hội đồng Tư vấn Kinh doanh APEC nên xây dựng bộ hướng dẫn thúc đẩy kinh doanh bền vững APEC với trọng tâm là doanh nghiệp vừa và nhỏ. Thưa quý vị, theo Ngân hàng Thế giới, Việt Nam thuộc nhóm các quốc gia chịu tác động nặng nề nhất với biến đổi khí hậu, nước biển dân, đặc biệt là tại đồng bằng sông Cửu Long. Nhà nước, doanh nghiệp và toàn dân chúng tôi hiểu rõ nguy cơ và cơ hội đang xen, đồng thời cam kết hành động quyết liệt để chuyển đổi mô hình kinh tế sang tăng trưởng xanh và ứng phó toàn diện với biến đổi khí hậu. Tại hội nghị COP26, Việt Nam đã mạnh mẽ cam kết đến 2050 đạt cân bằng phát thải net zero, nâng tỷ lệ năng lượng tái tạo lên trên 30% trong tổng nguồn cung năng lượng sơ cấp và tỷ lệ che phủ rừng ổn định ở mức 43%. Phát triển xanh lấy con người làm trung tâm, dựa vào thể chế và quản trị hiện đại, khoa học và công nghệ tiên tiến, nguồn nhân lực chất lượng cao. Trong quá trình này, chúng tôi mong muốn tăng cường hợp tác hơn nữa với APEC, các quốc gia doanh nghiệp trong nước và quốc tế. Bên cạnh việc tiếp tục cải thiện môi trường đầu tư kinh doanh, Việt Nam cũng xây dựng cơ chế ưu đãi cho các doanh nghiệp nắm bắt cơ hội tham gia cung ứng sản phẩm và dịch vụ xanh, hoàn thiện thể chế, chính sách về phát triển các doanh nghiệp xanh, đổi mới sáng tạo các khu công nghiệp sinh thái. Những chính sách này cùng với thị trường 100 triệu dân và mạng lưới rộng lớn của 14 hiệp định thương mại tự do đã tham gia là cơ hội, điều kiện thuận lợi để các nhà đầu tư quốc tế đến với Việt Nam để cùng hợp tác, cùng chia sẻ lợi ích và phát triển bền vững. Thành công của các bạn là thành công của chúng tôi. Thưa quý vị, tôi tin rằng với sự đoàn kết và quyết tâm, chúng ta sẽ vượt qua mọi thách thức và cùng nhau xây dựng một khu vực châu Á Thái Bình Dương hòa bình, thịnh vượng và phát triển bền vững. Xin chúc cộng đồng doanh nghiệp châu Á Thái Bình Dương ngày càng lớn mạnh và thành công. Xin cảm ơn.
We're entering the golden age of robotics, and enterprises have spent the last 10 years automating their digital systems, and the next 10 years they're going to be focused on automating their physical environments. This is going to have a fundamental shift in the productivity of companies going forward. Rocos is a cloud platform for connecting, monitoring and coordinating fleets of autonomous mobile robots. Richard, my co-founder, and I created the company 4 years ago, ready to solve this problem around how people could connect to mobile robots. So what we do is we work with robotics engineers to help them install a software application on their robot, which gives them that secure connectivity from a remote location. So an example is in the construction sector, we use ground robotics to actually take cameras into that environment and fully autonomously scan that environment for engineers and architects to manage the progress. Microsoft Azure is a fantastic platform to work on because not only can it handle a huge amount of data built for things like IoT systems, robotics is even much bigger data because of the hundreds of sensors that exist on the robot. So our ability to capture and process that data real time is a critical function of what we're doing. We've got customers in over 7 countries already, and to get the reach of having a secure platform that any of those customers can then get access to their cloud infrastructure gives us a huge advantage from day one.
At Microsoft, we're really passionate about empowering organisations like Rocos to achieve more. And we just love their innovative customer-centric solution, all being built in New Zealand to take on the world. Rocos is leveraging Azure DevOps, enabling them to take their software to the globe using platform as a service technologies. This means that they can focus on their software and deliver that to their customers wherever they are, leaving the platform management to Microsoft.
Our vision for the company going forward is really to continue to scale globally. It's about being the ubiquitous platform for automating the physical world using mobile robots.